Amelia ran her fingers over the yellowed pages of the old book she'd found tucked away in a dusty corner of the library. The Most Haunted Places in England was emblazoned on the cracked spine, the title barely legible through years of neglect. She smiled, brushing off a layer of dust as she flipped through the pages. It wasn't exactly her style, but it did spark a mischievous idea. The perfect wedding venue, something to make their day unforgettable. "Victor!" she called out, glancing over at her fiancé, who was busy perusing a stack of brochures advertising grand manors and luxurious hotels. "What do you think of this?" Victor looked up, a slight frown creasing his brow as he walked over. "What have you found now?" he asked, his tone half joking. Amelia was known for her unconventional ideas, and he had learned to expect the unexpected. "St. Agnes Chapel," she said, holding the book out to him. "It's in the middle of nowhere, and it's supposedly haunted." Victor took the book, skimming the entry. The description was brief, noting the chapel's remote location on the edge of a forgotten forest and the tragedy that had befallen it centuries ago. According to the book, the chapel had been the site of a devastating fire during a wedding, leaving everyone inside to perish. Since then, it had been abandoned, its charred walls and broken stained glass serving as a grim reminder of that fateful day. "Sounds a bit morbid, don't you think?" Victor asked, though he could see the excitement in Amelia's eyes. "Maybe," she replied with a shrug, "but it's got history. And think of the stories we could tell our kids one day." Victor chuckled, shaking his head. "You're serious about this, aren't you?" "Absolutely. Plus, it's available and way cheaper than any of the other places we've looked at. And come on, how many people get married in a haunted chapel? It'll be an adventure." He couldn't deny that. Amelia had a way of turning the mundane into something extraordinary. Despite the uneasy feeling the idea gave him, he found himself agreeing. After all, they could make it their own, a unique story to start their life together. 2 weeks later, they were driving down a narrow, winding road that led them deeper into the countryside, the GPS signal fading with each mile. The trees thickened, their branches intertwining overhead, casting deep shadows across the road. It was a gray afternoon, the sky heavy with clouds that promised rain. Victor kept his eyes on the road while Amelia clutched a map, tracing their route with a finger. "There," she said, pointing ahead. "That should be the turnoff." Victor slowed the car as they approached a weathered signpost, barely visible through the overgrowth. The faded letters spelled out St. Agnes Chapel, though the name had almost been swallowed by time. He turned the car onto a gravel path, the tires crunching over loose stones as they made their way deeper into the woods. After what felt like an eternity, the chapel came into view, emerging from the trees like a specter from the past. It was smaller than they had imagined, with ivy creeping up its stone walls and a tall, narrow steeple that seemed to pierce the sky. The windows were shattered, the glass long gone, and the wooden door hung slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. Amelia stepped out of the car, her breath catching in her throat as she took in the sight. There was a beauty to the place, in its own eerie way. The wildflowers that had overtaken the front yard contrasted sharply with the dark stone of the chapel, softening its harsh lines. Yet there was something undeniably unsettling about it too, as if the air itself held the memory of something tragic. Victor joined her, his expression unreadable as he stared at the chapel. "You sure about this?" he asked quietly. Amelia nodded, though she couldn't shake the feeling that they were intruding on something sacred, something that had been left undisturbed for far too long. As they approached the entrance, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves and sending a shiver down her spine. The door groaned as Victor pushed it open, revealing the dim interior. Dust motes danced in the beams of light that filtered through the broken windows, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. Amelia stepped inside, her footsteps echoing off the stone floor. The chapel was almost empty, save for a few broken pews and a crumbling altar at the far end. The walls were blackened with soot, the scars of the fire still visible after all these years. She could almost imagine the flames licking up the walls, consuming everything in their path. Victor walked ahead, his hand brushing against the stone as he inspected the damage. "It's haunting," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Perfect for a wedding," Amelia said, trying to keep her tone light, though her heart was pounding in her chest. They spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the chapel and the surrounding grounds, making notes of what needed to be done to prepare for the wedding. Despite the unease that lingered in the back of her mind, Amelia couldn't help but feel a strange connection to the place, as if she had been drawn here for a reason. As they left the chapel that evening, the sky had darkened, the clouds hanging low and heavy. A distant rumble of thunder echoed through the woods, and a gust of wind swept through the trees, sending the branches swaying. Amelia glanced back at the chapel, its silhouette stark against the darkening sky. For a moment she thought she saw a flicker of movement in one of the windows, but when she blinked, it was gone. She shook her head, chiding herself for being jumpy. It was just an old building after all. What harm could it possibly do? The days leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of preparations. The old chapel was transformed piece by piece as Amelia and Victor worked tirelessly to bring their vision to life. The local florist arrived with armfuls of wildflowers, filling the once barren space with bursts of color and life. The decaying pews were repaired, and the altar was adorned with candles and greenery, creating an intimate, rustic charm. Yet despite the outward improvements, something about the chapel remained unsettling. The sense of unease that had greeted Amelia on her first visit lingered, growing more pronounced with each passing day. It began with the whispers. At first, they were barely noticeable, indistinguishable from the rustling of leaves outside or the creaks of the old building settling. Amelia heard them mostly at night, as she lay in bed at the small cottage they had rented nearby. Just as she was drifting off to sleep, a soft murmur would slip through the silence, like a distant conversation carried on the wind. She would strain to hear, trying to catch the words, but they were always just out of reach, dissolving into nothing before she could make sense of them. "Did you hear that?" she asked Victor one night, her voice barely above a whisper. The darkness of the cottage seemed thicker somehow, as if it pressed down on them. "Hear what?" Victor replied, his voice groggy with sleep. "Voices. I think they're coming from the chapel." Victor sighed, turning over to face her. "It's an old building, Amelia. It's going to make noise. You're just stressed. The wedding's in a few days and you've been working non-stop." Amelia wanted to believe him. She nodded and tried to push the whispers from her mind, but they persisted. The following night they grew louder, more insistent, like a chorus of voices just beyond the walls. This time they sounded closer, almost as if they were right outside the cottage. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding as she strained to listen. There it was again, a low, indistinct murmur that sent a chill racing down her spine. She shook Victor awake, desperation in her voice. "Listen, do you hear it now?" Victor sat up, rubbing his eyes. He listened, the room falling into an eerie silence. Then he shook his head. "I don't hear anything, Amelia. You're just tired. It's probably the wind." But Amelia knew it wasn't the wind. The whispers had a quality to them, something that felt alive. It was as if they were trying to communicate, to reach out from the shadows and into the light. She didn't mention it again, not wanting to seem paranoid, but she started to dread the nights, knowing the voices would come. The whispers followed her to the chapel, growing louder whenever she was alone. They echoed off the stone walls, slipping into her thoughts, and she could feel their presence, cold and clammy, brushing against her skin like the fingers of the dead. One afternoon, as she was arranging flowers at the altar, the whispers suddenly rose to a crescendo, filling the air with a cacophony of unintelligible voices. Amelia froze, her hands trembling as the sound surrounded her, pressing in from all sides. It was as if the chapel itself was alive, breathing out its tortured history in a chorus of ghostly voices. "Amelia!" Victor's voice broke through the noise, and the whispers abruptly ceased, leaving a ringing silence in their wake. She turned to see him standing in the doorway, concern etched across his face. "You okay? You look pale." Amelia forced a smile, nodding. "Just a bit overwhelmed, I guess." Victor walked over, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Maybe we should take a break. We've been working non-stop. How about we go into town, grab a coffee or something, clear our heads?" Amelia hesitated. The idea of leaving the chapel, even for a little while, filled her with a strange sense of dread, as if something would happen in their absence. But she knew Victor was right. They needed a break, and maybe some time away would help her shake this growing sense of unease. "Okay," she agreed, her voice shaky. "Let's go." They locked up the chapel and made their way down the gravel path, the trees whispering in the wind as they passed. As they drove away, Amelia glanced back at the chapel, its dark silhouette stark against the cloudy sky. A flicker of movement caught her eye, something in one of the shattered windows, a shadow that moved too quickly to be a trick of the light. She turned away, forcing herself to focus on the road ahead. But the unease stayed with her, a gnawing fear that burrowed deeper with each passing moment. That evening, after they returned from town, the whispers returned with a vengeance. Amelia sat up in bed, her heart pounding as the voices seemed to surround the cottage, pressing in from all sides. She could hear them clearly now, though their words were still unintelligible, a frantic jumble of pleas and warnings that sent a chill racing through her body. And then, just as suddenly as they had begun, the whispers stopped. Amelia held her breath, straining to hear. The silence was almost worse, oppressive in its stillness. She reached for Victor's hand, needing the reassurance of his touch, but her fingers brushed against something cold and damp. She yanked her hand back, her pulse racing as she turned on the bedside lamp. The light flickered on, casting a warm glow over the room, but nothing seemed out of place. Victor was fast asleep beside her, his breathing slow and steady. Amelia stared at her hand, expecting to see something, anything, that would explain the sensation. But there was nothing, no sign of whatever it was she had touched. She shivered, pulling the covers tighter around her, trying to shake off the lingering fear. But as she lay back down, the whispers resumed, louder than before, as if they were right beside her, speaking directly into her ear. The words were still indistinct, but one word seemed to rise above the rest, clear and unmistakable. "Fire!" Amelia bolted upright, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She turned on the lamp again, frantically looking around the room, but there was nothing. No sign of smoke, no crackle of flames, just the oppressive silence, broken only by the sound of her own racing heartbeat. She looked at Victor, still sleeping peacefully beside her, oblivious to the terror that gripped her. For a moment, she considered waking him, telling him everything she had experienced. But what could she say? That she was being haunted by voices that only she could hear? That something in the chapel was trying to warn her, or worse, trying to harm her? No, she couldn't burden him with that. Not when the wedding was so close, and they had so much to do. But as she lay back down, her heart still pounding, Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. The whispers had warned her of fire, and though she didn't understand what it meant, she knew she had to find out before it was too late. The morning light streamed through the windows of the small cottage, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Amelia sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. She hadn't slept much the night before, her mind still reeling from the whispered warning. The word fire echoed in her thoughts, filling her with a sense of dread she couldn't shake. Victor was outside, talking with the caterer about final arrangements. The wedding was just days away, and the excitement that had once filled her was now tainted with fear. Amelia knew she couldn't keep this to herself any longer. She needed answers, something to explain the strange occurrences, the whispers, the visions that haunted her. The old book about haunted places that she'd found in the library sat on the table before her, its pages still open to the section about St. Agnes Chapel. She had read the entry a dozen times, but it offered little more than a brief account of the fire that had consumed the chapel centuries ago. There were no details, no names, nothing that could help her understand the connection between that long-ago tragedy and the events unfolding now. As if in answer to her silent plea, there was a knock at the door. Amelia jumped, startled by the sudden sound, and hurried to answer it. Standing on the doorstep was an elderly woman, her back hunched with age and her face lined with deep wrinkles. She wore a faded shawl over her shoulders and clutched a worn cane in one hand. Her eyes, though clouded with age, held a sharpness that sent a shiver down Amelia's spine. "Good morning," the woman said in a voice that was surprisingly strong. "Are you the young lady planning to wed at St. Agnes Chapel?" Amelia hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, I am. And you are?" The old woman's gaze seemed to pierce through her, as if she could see straight into Amelia's soul. "I'm Mrs. Kettering. I live just down the road. Been here my whole life. I heard about your wedding and I thought I'd stop by. There's something you ought to know about that chapel." Amelia's heart skipped a beat. "Please come in," she said, stepping aside to let the woman enter. Mrs. Kettering hobbled into the cottage, her cane tapping against the wooden floor as she made her way to the table. She lowered herself into a chair with a sigh of relief, and Amelia hurried to pour her a cup of tea. The old woman took a sip, her hands trembling slightly. "You've heard the stories, I'm sure," she began, her voice low and measured. "About the fire and the souls trapped inside." Amelia nodded. "But I don't know much beyond that. The book I found didn't have many details." Mrs. Kettering nodded slowly, her eyes distant as if she were peering back through time. "That fire happened nearly 300 years ago, on a day not so different from this one. It was a wedding, much like yours. The bride and groom were young and in love, full of hope for the future. But something went wrong that day. No one knows for sure how the fire started. Some say it was an accident, others whisper of foul play. But what we do know is that the doors were sealed shut, trapping everyone inside." Amelia shuddered, imagining the terror those people must have felt as the flames closed in. "And they all died?" Mrs. Kettering nodded grimly. "Every last one of them. The fire consumed the chapel, leaving nothing but charred stone and ash. The villagers could only watch as the flames raged, powerless to help. When it was finally over, they found the bodies, or what was left of them, huddled together in the ruins, They say the bride's dress was still smoldering when they pulled her out. Amelia swallowed hard, her throat dry. That's awful. But what does it have to do with now? Why are these things happening? The old woman's gaze sharpened and she leaned closer, lowering her voice to a whisper. Because their souls never found peace. They've been trapped in that chapel ever since, reliving that day over and over again, unable to move on. The fire was only the beginning. The true horror came afterward, when the spirits of the dead began to haunt the place, seeking justice, or perhaps revenge. Amelia's heart raced as Mrs. Kettering's words sank in. But why now? Why are they tormenting us? Mrs. Kettering sighed, shaking her head. It's the wedding. Your wedding has awakened them, stirred up old memories, old pain. They see you and your fiancé, and it reminds them of what they lost. They don't understand that you're not the ones who wronged them, that you had nothing to do with their deaths. To them, you're just another bride and groom, another pair of souls to drag into their torment. Amelia felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. What can we do? How do we stop this? The old woman's expression softened, and she reached out to place a frail hand on Amelia's. There may be a way, but it won't be easy. The spirits need closure, a way to find peace. They need to hear the vows that were never spoken, see the wedding that was never completed. If you can finish what they started, perhaps their souls will finally be able to rest. Amelia's mind raced as she tried to process what Mrs. Kettering was saying. You mean, we have to go through with the wedding? In the chapel? Mrs. Kettering nodded solemnly. Yes, but it must be done with respect, with the understanding that you are not just doing this for yourselves, but for them as well. It's a dangerous thing you're considering, but if you succeed, the spirits may finally find peace, and the curse on that chapel could be lifted. Amelia sat back in her chair, her thoughts swirling in a chaotic mix of fear and determination. The idea of going through with the wedding, knowing what she now knew, terrified her. But she also understood that they couldn't simply walk away. The spirits would follow them, their unrest growing until it consumed them too. Thank you, Amelia said quietly. I'll talk to Victor about this. We'll figure something out. Mrs. Kettering gave her a small, sad smile. I hope you do, dear. You've got a chance to end this cycle of suffering. But be careful. The dead don't always play by the rules of the living. With that, the old woman rose slowly from the table, her cane tapping against the floor as she made her way to the door. Amelia watched her go, her heart heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. As she closed the door behind Mrs. Kettering, Amelia felt the oppressive silence of the cottage press in around her. The whispers had stopped, but she knew they would return. The spirits were waiting, watching, their cold eyes fixed on her every move. And she knew that soon, she would have to face them, whether she was ready or not. The day of the wedding rehearsal dawned with a thick, oppressive fog that clung to the trees and blanketed the landscape in a suffocating gray. The air was heavy with moisture, the kind that seeped into your bones and made everything feel cold and damp. Amelia awoke with a tight knot of anxiety in her chest, the events of the previous day replaying in her mind like a twisted dream. Mrs. Kettering's warning echoed in her thoughts as she dressed in front of the small mirror in the cottage. She had spent hours agonizing over whether to tell Victor about the old woman's visit, about the spirits that haunted the chapel. But every time she tried to find the words, they stuck in her throat, and the fear of sounding irrational kept her silent. Victor had noticed her unease, of course. He had always been attuned to her moods, but when she brushed off his concerns with a strained smile and excuses about wedding stress, he seemed to accept it. She hated keeping something so important from him, but the thought of him dismissing her fears, or worse, being caught up in them, made her stomach churn. As they drove to the chapel that morning, the fog hung thick around them, reducing the world to little more than the narrow road ahead and the dim outlines of trees on either side. The silence between them was heavy, punctuated only by the occasional creak of the car's suspension as they hit a bump in the road. Amelia stared out the window, her thoughts swirling in a chaotic mix of fear and determination. When they finally arrived at the chapel, the sight that greeted them was almost surreal. The building loomed out of the fog like a shadowy apparition, its dark stone walls and shattered windows giving it the appearance of a forgotten relic from another time. The wildflowers that had once brightened the front yard now seemed muted, their colors dulled by the heavy mist. Victor parked the car and turned to her, his brow furrowed with concern. "Are you sure you're okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. Amelia forced a smile, though it felt brittle. "I'm fine, just a bit tired. Let's get this rehearsal over with, okay?" He studied her for a moment longer, as if searching for something behind her words, but then he nodded and got out of the car. Amelia followed, her heart pounding in her chest as they made their way to the chapel entrance. The door creaked loudly as Victor pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty space like a groan of protest. As they stepped inside, the familiar musty smell of damp earth and decaying wood greeted them. But there was something else now too, a faint, acrid scent that made the hairs on the back of Amelia's neck stand on end. The candles they had arranged around the altar flickered weakly in the dim light, their flames barely piercing the gloom. The pews, once carefully restored, now seemed warped and twisted, as if they had been exposed to a great heat. Amelia's stomach clenched as she noticed the blackened edges of the wooden benches, the subtle reminder of the fire that had once ravaged this place. Their small wedding party began to arrive, a group of close friends and family who had no idea of the ominous history of the chapel. They chatted quietly among themselves, their voices muted by the heavy atmosphere. As the rehearsal began, Amelia tried to focus on the task at hand, but her mind kept drifting back to Mrs. Kettering's words and the whispers that had tormented her in the nights before. The minister, a kindly man in his 60s, cleared his throat and called for everyone's attention. He ran through the order of the ceremony, his voice steady and reassuring, but Amelia could barely concentrate. Her gaze kept drifting to the shadows that pooled in the corners of the chapel, where the light from the candles didn't quite reach. Every time she looked away, she had the unsettling sensation that something was moving just beyond the edge of her vision. When it was time for Amelia and Victor to practice their vows, she stepped forward, her heart racing. Victor smiled at her, his eyes filled with warmth and love. But as he began to speak, a sudden gust of wind blew through the chapel, extinguishing the candles in a single breath. The temperature dropped abruptly, and the once still air became charged with a palpable tension. The minister paused, his brow furrowing in confusion. "That's strange," he muttered, glancing around. "There shouldn't be a draft in here." Victor glanced at Amelia, a frown of concern creasing his forehead. "Are you okay?" Before she could answer, the organ at the back of the chapel began to play, its keys moving on their own, the haunting melody filling the space with an eerie, discordant tune. The notes were twisted, distorted, as if being played by unseen hands that had long forgotten the art of music. The sound was unnerving, grating on the ears and sending shivers down the spine. The wedding party froze, their expressions ranging from confusion to fear as they stared at the ancient instrument. Amelia's heart pounded in her chest as she turned to the source of the music, her breath catching in her throat. The organ continued to play, the melody growing louder and more insistent, filling the chapel with a sense of impending doom. Victor took a step toward the organ, his expression one of determined disbelief. "There must be a logical explanation for this," he said, though his voice wavered slightly. But before he could reach it, the front doors of the chapel slammed shut with a deafening bang, causing everyone to jump. The organ's music abruptly ceased, leaving behind an oppressive silence that pressed down on them like a physical weight. Amelia's eyes widened in terror as the shadows in the corners of the chapel began to move, coalescing into dark, indistinct shapes. The air grew colder still, and the acrid scent of smoke became overpowering. She could see them now, figures emerging from the darkness, their forms flickering like flames in the wind. They were dressed in tattered, charred remnants of wedding attire, their faces pale and hollow, their eyes empty sockets that stared out with a haunting emptiness. The spirits of the dead had come to witness their final moments. The guests began to panic, some whispering prayers, others backing away toward the doors, only to find them unyielding, as if held shut by an unseen force. The minister, his hands shaking, tried to regain control of the situation, but his words faltered as the ghostly figures moved closer, their presence sending a chill through the air. Amelia felt rooted to the spot, her body frozen with fear as the spirits gathered around the altar, their hollow eyes fixed on her and Victor. The whispers returned, louder now, filling the space with a cacophony of voices that overlapped and tangled, their words still indecipherable, but laced with desperation and rage. She tried to speak, to reach out to the spirits, but her voice caught in her throat, and all that came out was a strangled whisper. "Please, what do you want?" The spirits didn't answer, but their eyes, those empty, dark voids, seemed to bore into her soul, their silent agony searing into her mind. The temperature continued to drop, and she could see her breath misting in the air, mingling with the smoke that had begun to creep along the floor like a living thing. Victor took her hand, his grip tight and reassuring, but she could feel the tremor in his touch. "We need to get out of here," he whispered, his voice filled with urgency. Amelia nodded, but as they turned to leave, the organ let out a final deafening chord that echoed through the chapel, vibrating through their bones. The flames suddenly roared to life, engulfing the altar in a brilliant, blinding light. The fire crackled and hissed, and the heat was unbearable, yet the spirits remained, their forms silhouetted against the flames, unmoving and relentless. The wedding rehearsal had become something far more sinister, a reenactment of a tragedy long past, and Amelia knew they were being drawn into the same nightmare that had claimed so many lives before them. With the flames closing in and the spirits surrounding them, Amelia and Victor realized they were not merely rehearsing a wedding. They were fighting for their lives. The morning of the wedding dawned with a heavy sky, dark clouds rolling in like an ominous shroud. The oppressive atmosphere matched the dread that clung to Amelia as she prepared for the ceremony. The events of the rehearsal were burned into her mind, the sight of the flames and the ghosts lingering in her thoughts like a nightmare she couldn't shake. But despite the terror she felt, there was no turning back now. Mrs. Kettering's words haunted her. This wedding had to happen, and it had to happen at the chapel. Amelia's bridal gown was a simple, elegant design, ivory lace cascading down to the floor. It should have filled her with joy to wear it, to see herself as a bride ready to walk down the aisle. But as she stood in front of the mirror in the small cottage, all she could see was the reflection of the ghostly bride she had seen in her visions. The charred dress, the blackened skin, the hollow, lifeless eyes. She shook her head, trying to dispel the image, but it clung to her mind like a dark shadow. The whispers had returned that night, louder and more insistent than ever, filling her dreams with visions of fire and death. She could still hear them now, faint murmurs at the edge of her consciousness, as if the spirits were waiting, watching her every move. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts, and she turned to see Victor standing in the doorway. He looked handsome in his suit, but his face was pale, his eyes shadowed with concern. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice soft but strained. Amelia nodded, though her heart felt heavy with dread. "As ready as I'll ever be." Victor stepped into the room, crossing the small distance to her. He took her hands in his touch warm and reassuring. "We can still leave, you know. We don't have to do this." Amelia looked into his eyes, the temptation to run overwhelming. But she knew they couldn't escape the chapel's curse. The spirits would follow them, tormenting them until they fulfilled their grim purpose. "No," she said quietly. "We have to do this. For them." Victor searched her eyes for a moment, then nodded, a look of determination settling over his features. "Then we'll do it together." They left the cottage, hand in hand, the world outside bathed in a gray, muted light. The walk to the chapel felt longer than it had before, the gravel path crunching beneath their feet as they approached the looming structure. The guests had already gathered inside, their hushed voices drifting out into the heavy air. The chapel seemed to absorb the light, its dark stone walls blending into the sky, making it appear as if it was a part of the storm itself. As they approached the doors, Amelia hesitated, a shiver running down her spine. The memory of the rehearsal played out in her mind, the sudden cold, the flames, the sight of those haunted figures trapped in their eternal torment. She could almost feel their presence now, hovering just beyond the threshold, waiting for her to enter. Victor squeezed her hand, grounding her in the moment. She took a deep breath, pushing down her fear, and stepped forward. The doors creaked open, and they walked inside together. The atmosphere in the chapel was thick with tension. The guests, oblivious to the full extent of the chapel's curse, sat quietly in the restored pews, their expressions a mixture of anticipation and unease. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and there was a faint smell of smoke that lingered just beneath the surface. The candles flickered, their flames weak and unsteady, casting long, wavering shadows across the walls. Amelia and Victor walked down the aisle, the silence almost deafening. She could feel the weight of unseen eyes on her, could sense the presence of the spirits watching her every move. The whispers were louder now, filling her head with their frantic, desperate pleas. When they reached the altar, the minister gave them a tight, nervous smile. He had been shaken by the events of the rehearsal, but like the others, he had chalked it up to nerves and the odd atmosphere of the old chapel. But Amelia knew better. She could feel the spirits pressing in, their anguish a palpable force that filled the room. As the ceremony began, Amelia tried to focus on the minister's words, but her attention kept drifting to the shadows that seemed to move of their own accord, creeping closer with every passing moment. The temperature in the chapel began to rise, the air growing thick and stifling. She could see beads of sweat forming on Victor's brow, his grip on her hand tightening as if he could sense the danger that loomed over them. The minister's voice wavered slightly as he asked Victor to recite his vows. Victor turned to her, his eyes filled with love and fear in equal measure, and began to speak. But as the words left his lips, the temperature spiked, and the acrid smell of smoke filled the air. Amelia's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She could feel it now, the heat, the flames licking at the edges of her consciousness, the crackle of fire growing louder, more insistent. The walls of the chapel seemed to pulse with energy, the shadows twisting and writhing as the spirits gathered around them. When it was her turn to speak, Amelia opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat. The flames were closer now. She could feel them, could see them in the corner of her vision, creeping up the walls and licking at the edges of her dress. She looked down, and for a terrifying moment, she saw herself engulfed in fire, her gown burning away as the flames consumed her. But when she blinked, the vision was gone, replaced by the dull, flickering light of the chapel. Her dress was intact, her skin untouched, but the terror remained. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and she could feel the spirits pressing in, their cold, clammy presence mingling with the searing heat of the phantom fire. Victor squeezed her hand, a silent encouragement. She took a shaky breath and forced herself to speak. "I, Amelia, take you, Victor, to be my lawfully wedded husband." But as she spoke the words, the flames roared to life around them, real this time, the heat searing and unbearable. The guests gasped, some crying out in fear as the fire spread rapidly, devouring the walls, the pews, the very air around them. The chapel was alight with an unholy blaze, the fire licking at the stone, blackening it, turning the ancient structure into an inferno. The spirits were everywhere now, their forms flickering in and out of the flames, their hollow eyes fixed on the bride and groom. Amelia could see them clearly, their mouths open in silent screams, their hands reaching out, desperate, pleading. The altar was engulfed in flames, the heat intense enough to sear flesh from bone, and yet there they stood, trapped in the eye of the storm, unharmed but unable to escape. The flames surrounded them, a wall of fire that pulsed with the energy of the restless dead. Victor pulled her close, shielding her from the flames as best he could, but there was no escaping the heat, the terror that consumed them both. The chapel was burning, the spirits were rising, and there was no way out. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the fire died down, leaving only the faint glow of embers and the thick, choking smoke that filled the air. The whispers faded, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to stretch on forever. The spirits were gone, their forms dissipated into the shadows, leaving behind only the lingering sense of their anguish. Amelia and Victor stood at the altar, shaken but unharmed, their hands still clasped tightly together. The chapel was a ruin, the walls blackened, the pews charred and twisted. But somehow, impossibly, they had survived. The guests, stunned and terrified, began to murmur among themselves, unsure of what they had just witnessed. The minister, pale and trembling, stepped back from the altar, his hands shaking as he clutched his prayer book to his chest. Amelia looked up at Victor, her heart still pounding in her chest. "What just happened?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from the smoke. Victor shook his head, his expression one of disbelief. "I don't know, but I think we finished it." The chapel was silent now, the oppressive weight of the spirits lifted, the air clear of the acrid smoke. The curse had been lifted, the spirits finally at rest. But as they stood there, in the aftermath of the flames, Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left unfinished, something important that still lingered in the shadows of the past. And as the last of the embers died out, she knew that their ordeal was not yet over. The chapel stood in eerie silence as the last remnants of the fire faded into wisps of smoke, leaving behind a charred ruin. The guests were stunned, whispering in hushed tones, their faces pale with fear and confusion. The once grand structure had been reduced to a haunting shell of what it was, and yet Victor and Amelia remained at the altar, untouched by the flames that had threatened to consume them. Amelia's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. The spirits had risen, the fire had raged, and yet here they were, alive. But the sense of unease, the feeling that something was still wrong, gnawed at her. She glanced at Victor, his face drawn with worry, and squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his presence. "We need to finish this," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling of dying embers. Victor nodded, his eyes reflecting the same determination. "Whatever it takes." The minister, shaken but resolute, stepped forward. His voice trembled as he spoke, but he carried on, knowing that something more than a simple ceremony was at stake. "We are gathered here today," he began, his voice echoing in the broken remains of the chapel, "to join Amelia and Victor in holy matrimony. But today, we also seek to bring peace to those who have suffered in this place." Amelia felt a shiver run down her spine as the temperature in the chapel began to drop once more. The shadows, which had seemed to recede in the wake of the fire, began to lengthen, stretching across the floor like dark fingers reaching out for something just beyond their grasp. Victor's grip on her hand tightened, and she took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. She knew that this was more than a simple wedding now. It was a ritual, a final act that would either bring peace to the tortured souls or seal their fate forever. The minister continued, his voice steadying as he recited the familiar words of the wedding ceremony. But as he spoke, the air around them grew colder, the light dimming until it seemed as though they were standing in twilight, the world outside the chapel fading away. Amelia could feel them now, the spirits, watching, waiting. They had come so far, but she knew that their journey was not yet complete. There was something they had to do, something that had been left unfinished centuries ago. When the time came for them to exchange their vows, Amelia hesitated. She could feel the weight of the spirit's gaze, their presence pressing in on her, demanding something more than just words. She glanced at Victor and he nodded, encouraging her to speak. Taking a deep breath, Amelia began. "Victor, from the moment we found this chapel, I knew our love was strong enough to face whatever challenges came our way. But I also know that our love isn't just about us. It's about honoring those who came before us, those who never got to say their vows, who never had the chance to live the life they dreamed of. Today I vow to you that I will carry their memories with us, that we will live the life they were denied, and that we will find peace for them and for ourselves." Her words hung in the air, resonating in the silence that followed. The shadows seemed to draw closer, the cold biting at her skin, but she held her ground, refusing to back down. Victor took her hands in his voice strong and clear as he responded. "Amelia, I vow to stand by your side through whatever trials we may face. I promise to honor those who have suffered, to remember them, and to cherish the life we have been given. Together, we will face the darkness, and together, we will find the light." As the final words left his lips, the chapel seemed to tremble, the very air vibrating with a low, mournful sound. The shadows began to swirl, converging at the altar where they stood, the cold intensifying until it was almost unbearable. But neither of them moved, standing firm as the darkness closed in around them. The minister, sensing the urgency, quickly moved to complete the ceremony. "By the power vested in me," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." Victor leaned in, his lips brushing against Amelia's in a soft, tender kiss. For a moment the world seemed to stop, the cold receding as warmth spread through her. But as they pulled away, the shadows exploded in a burst of light, the darkness lifting like a veil being pulled away. Suddenly, the chapel was bathed in a warm golden light, and the cold dissipated, replaced by a gentle warmth that soothed the soul. The shadows were gone, the spirits vanished, their presence no longer felt. The air was clear, the acrid smell of smoke replaced by the sweet scent of wildflowers. The guests, who had been frozen in fear, slowly began to relax, their expression shifting from terror to relief. The minister stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow, and gave them a small, weary smile. "It's over," Victor whispered, his voice filled with wonder. "We did it." Amelia nodded, tears of relief welling up in her eyes. She could feel it now. The chapel was no longer haunted by the spirits of the past. They had found peace, their suffering finally ended by the vows spoken that day. But as they turned to leave, hand in hand, Amelia felt a strange tug in her chest, a sense of something still unfinished. She paused, glancing back at the altar, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw a figure standing there, a bride in a charred dress, her face serene, her eyes no longer hollow but filled with gratitude. The vision lasted only a second, and then it was gone, leaving behind a sense of calm that she hadn't felt in days. The chapel, once a place of torment and tragedy, was now filled with light and warmth, a sanctuary of peace. Amelia and Victor stepped out into the sunlight, the storm clouds that had hung over the chapel finally breaking apart to reveal a bright, clear sky. The nightmare was over, the curse lifted, and as they walked down the path together, Amelia knew that they had not just begun a new chapter in their own lives, but had also brought closure to a story that had haunted the chapel for centuries. And as they walked away from the chapel, hand in hand, they left behind the shadows of the past, ready to face whatever the future held.